at trans people's experiences of health services and the impact on their mental health. The research team was led by Jay McNeil and also included Liz Bailey, Sonia Ellis, myself and Maeve Reagan. So in terms of the respondents, we asked them which of the following best describes you, and we really found that there was a range of different types of gender identity, some of which were very constant and relatively binary, such as being a woman or a man, while others were clearly non-binary and more variable or fluid. And there was also people who said they didn't have a gender identity, or that they were unsure, or that they had another way of describing themselves that didn't fit into any of those suggestions that we'd given people. So it's really important to note that at least 35% of the trans respondents did not fit a binary transsexual narrative. Now, even the people who were in the other 65% who selected either constant and clear gender identity as a woman or constant and clear gender identity as a man may not necessarily fit a classical transsexual narrative either. But they have a sort of better, more sporting chance of being seen as fitting it by gender clinicians, for example. But despite the fact that there was this large percentage of people who wouldn't describe themselves as simply being a man or a woman, only 13% of the respondents didn't wish to undergo any transition. So there's a sizable number of people who do not fit a binary transsexual model, but who nonetheless wish to receive some form of assistance with the transition from one gender to another, although it's not necessarily to a clearly binary male or female end gender identity. So there's this tension between trying to be authentic in your self-actualization and trying to keep things simple enough for everybody else around you to understand and support your experience. And these three quotes we felt sort of illustrated that tension between simplicity and authenticity. So one person said, "I say I am genderqueer as I don't see myself as male or female, but go under trans guy to simplify things." Another said, "A year ago, my gender identity was not woman. I now identify as male, but part of the reason for that is that it's easier than identifying as non-binary. If there were more accepted genders, I would probably be just masculine of centre." And another said, "I would almost say constant and clear non-binary, except I've put so much time and energy into my physical and official transition from binary male to binary female that to do so feels like a betrayal of both myself and of the women I met in the process. I needed badly to transition away from maleness, and in order to get that, I had to represent myself to various doctors and psychotherapists as being clearly and consistently female, which, while less wrong than my assigned gender, is not quite on the mark. I know that some of my comrades in the journey were in the same position." So there is really this tension at the moment between trying to really encapsulate and explore and understand your own individual unique experience of gender and the various simplistic categories that you're expected by society and by the medical profession to fall into in order to be seen as needing particular support or treatment or acceptance or legal rights. We then went on and asked people about their first appointments at gender clinics. What we found was that there was 293 people who had been seen by gender identity clinics. So that out of 889 is obviously quite a relatively small percentage, and a lot of people who were wanting or interested in transition hadn't necessarily gone near a gender identity clinic at the point of the survey. Of the people who had been seen by a gender identity clinic, 30% had been seen at a gender clinic less than a year ago. 42% had been seen in the last 1 to 6 years, and 15% had been seen in 7 to 12 years ago. So it wasn't that these were all people who transitioned many, many years ago through sort of like kind of old school versions of gender identity clinic protocols. The vast majority of people responding and saying about their experiences at gender identity clinics were doing so in relatively recent years. And one of the things that was flagged up as a really major problem was the length of waiting time for that first gender identity clinic appointment. 60% had waited for up to a year, 32% had waited for 1 to 3 years, and 8% had waited over 3 years from the time that they first asked for assistance and to be seen at a gender identity clinic, and finally got to actually speak face-to-face with somebody at one. And 58% of the respondents who'd been seen at a gender identity clinic felt that their wait harmed their mental health. And so this is just one example quote of numerous ones. Waiting for access to the GIC had a devastating effect on my mental health. By the time I came forward for help, I needed it urgently. Such a delay caused me serious mental distress. Moreover, my long-term relationship suffered because of the uncertainty about my transition going forward. Words cannot express the harm done. So yeah, when somebody reaches that point of taking the step, not knowing exactly what they're going to face when they get to a gender identity clinic, not knowing how supportive or not that response is going to be, they take the plunge and they ask to be seen. That's really because they've reached that point of desperately wanting assistance, and to then be left languishing on a waiting list with no idea if they are going to be seen in any particular timescale is extremely traumatic. And one of the areas that people were really asking to be addressed: how can people receive quicker support? How can they be informed of what they can expect, be supported to think through different options while they're waiting for a clinic appointment? And how can those clinic appointments be faster in being received? Then once people were actually seen at a GIC, 46% of the respondents felt that they had experienced difficulties obtaining the treatment they needed. And this covered a range of issues, but I'm going to flag up the ones that particularly were around protocol and clinician attitudes. Some of the difficulties were more just kind of practical, such as the appointment was sent to the wrong address, or they didn't get given sort of a letter by their NHS funder sort of confirming that they were being funded for a particular stage. But I'm going to concentrate more on the things that are within the control of the gender identity clinicians. As my gender issue has created its own problems after being ignored and left untreated, to then go through such a narrow diagnostic procedure at the clinic with no degree of autonomy in the treatment of individual cases, I feel is unrealistic with regards to tackling this condition for me and potentially others. Another person said, one of the clinicians initially refused to start my hormone treatment due to his perspective on a personal situation within my close family. On my last appointment, where I was accompanied by one of my family to help explain the situation, another of the clinicians reviewed this matter and accepted that it should not have impacted on my treatment. I experienced the NHS GIC services as largely a paternalistic gatekeeping exercise, where psychiatrists exercise inappropriate levels of control over the lives and choices of patients. They ensure compliance by withholding or threatening to withhold access to treatment, bracket hormone surgery. Their primary purpose seems to be to make it as difficult as possible for people to access the hormone/surgery they need in order to save the NHS money. There is no transparency about the treatment pathway or clinical protocols. Having to negotiate the GIC system seriously hindered my transition. At many times it has left me feeling angry, disappointed, manipulated, controlled and despairing. The system is deeply flawed. Another person, questions were overly irrelevant, prying and sexual. 2 years real-life experiences, arbitrary, stressful, not supported by the WPATH standards of care version 7. Overall, I feel utterly powerless and infantilized in my dealings with them, entirely at the mercy of their restrictive, unpredictable, arrogant and incompetent service. So as you can see, some people were distinctly not happy with the current sort of experiences. Now, there were people who did say positive things as well, and I would like to stress that we're not trying to say that every single gender identity clinician is behaving in this manner. But what we are trying to say is that there is concern about the level of autonomy people can exercise in deciding their own treatment pathways, and the level of hoops that have to be jumped through, and that there's been a tendency for protocols not necessarily to move with the times, that they've kind of been sort of that kind of, well, that's what we've always done, so that's what we're going to continue doing, rather than looking at sort of, is this necessarily the latest evidence-based practice? Are there better ways of ensuring that people can explore and self-actualise? Here's some more quotes. The GIC also seemed to have very rigid ideas of masculinity and femininity. It seemed to be adhering to a now outmoded medical model. The outcome was the GIC failing to provide any form of support whatsoever. Some emotional support and advice on speaking to my family would have been helpful, and instead focused their time on interrogating me about my gender and sexuality, with one of my assessors asking me about sex positions and how this differed from heterosexual sex. And this was a theme that came out in a lot of the response answers, with this sort of obsession about masturbation and sex, sort of as somehow a proof of how male or female you were. And so yes, I think that maybe some visits to Bicon might sort of help people realise that there's a little bit more to sex than sort of simply kind of, do you do the missionary position or not, and expecting everybody's fantasies to be completely sort of like a heteronormative or a gender normative. So another person stated, they refused to treat me because I have a non-binary gender identity. Another said, the doctor had a very traditional, narrow view of transgender and felt that he could decide what gender I was after talking to me personally for 5 minutes and reading the results of the questionnaire I had filled out with his assistant. At the end, he explained that people didn't have more than one gender identity, so I must have something cross-dressing related and should be taken off hormones for a while to see how I settle down. So yes, particularly if people were expressing non-binary gender identities or a complex gender identity that was more fluid, this just wasn't seeming to compute for some clinicians, and they were like, no, if you've not known from the age of 2 that you were really a girl or really a boy, and felt this consistently forever, you're not transsexual, and therefore if you're not transsexual, you're not entitled to gender reassignment assistance. Instead of recognising that there's a really diverse way in which people might experience their gender, and that's sort of a process of exploration and a process of sophisticated nuance about the different aspects of gender and what matters most to them, is not necessarily something that means that they are unstable in their sense of gender, but instead can mean that they've actually been particularly reflective and particularly self-aware about the complexities of gender. And then one would hope that sort of like people would be able to discuss concerns at a gender identity clinic. But again, we got disturbing findings about sort of the degree to which people felt that they could actually talk to gender identity clinics about things that we would assume that the gender identity clinics would want them to talk to them about. So of the respondents who had attended the gender identity clinic, 34% said they had felt uncertain about their gender whilst attending the GIC. But of those who felt uncertain about their gender, only 52% had felt unable to discuss this with the gender identity clinic. So over half of the people who were feeling uncertain about their gender didn't think they could talk about that to the GIC clinicians. So if you can't talk about it to the GIC clinicians, who can you talk about it to? And what are the GIC clinicians actually able to help you with if it's not uncertainty about your gender? 62% had felt emotionally distressed or worried about their mental health whilst attending the GIC. And again, over half had felt unable to discuss with the GIC, and when asked sort of why, the majority of people were saying they were worried that if they admitted to feeling anxious about going into social situations, or if they felt depressed, that they would be seen as not well enough to continue their transition, that they would have things put on hold. So it was this catch-22 of needing to appear distressed enough to merit interventions of a medical nature, but not too distressed, or else you're not well enough or stable enough to get those interventions. So there's some kind of tiny little sort of delicate tightrope where you must balance on, yes, I'm dysphoric, but I'm not too dysphoric. When we actually looked at the levels of distress that our survey respondents were reporting, we used the Centre for Epidemiology Studies depression scale. Now, we're not trying to sort of say that we've clinically diagnosed people, these are guidelines about sort of levels of depression that they scored. 46% came under the non-depressed category of 0 to 15 score, which I think is really important to actually remember, is like kind of being trans doesn't mean that you are automatically depressed. It was not 100% people severely depressed. 46%, a really sizable number of people, did not score as currently being depressed. 18% scored as having mild depression, and 36% scored as having major depression within our survey respondents at the time of the survey. When we asked people about sort of like kind of lifetime prevalence, 88% felt that they had experienced depression at some point in their life, and 55% of those had received a diagnosis of depression at some point in their life. 75% felt they had experienced anxiety at some point in their life, of which 38% had received an anxiety diagnosis. So there was high levels of depression and anxiety, but again, not 100%. Therefore, kind of the concept of being trans doesn't need to mean that you must always experience distress. There are people who are trans-identified who have not experienced anxiety or depression, who have not experienced dysphoria of a clinical kind of nature. 23% felt they'd experienced addiction, with only 5% diagnosed. We had 24% who had said they'd used drugs in the last year, of which the majority had used cannabis, and the second highest number had been ecstasy. We had 19% who were current smokers, which was a lot lower than we thought it might be, and we think that's probably to do with the fact that in order to get estrogen, female hormones, the gender clinicians are often very strict about not smoking in order to reduce the risk of deep vein thrombosis. What we did find was a disturbingly high level of alcohol abuse. 62% of the respondents scored above 3 on an Audit C scale, which is evidence of problematic alcohol use. And I think it was 47% scored above 4. Now, I'm not an alcohol expert, so please don't ask me sort of exactly sort of like kind of more details about Audit C because I don't know the full details of that. And then when we looked at self-harm and suicide, we had 53% of respondents who had self-harmed at some point in their life, of which 11% were currently self-harming. We found that 84% of respondents had thought about ending their lives at some point, and of those, 27% had suicidal ideation within the last week, and 63% had had suicidal ideation within the last year. And then across all of the respondents, 35% had attempted suicide at least once, and 25% had attempted suicide more than once. So it is a population at high risk of suicide and self-harm. And then in terms of mental health services, 66% of the respondents had used mental health services for reasons other than access to gender reassignment. So we're not including those who had to see a psychiatrist because the psychiatrist was a gender identity clinic specialist. We're asking people about sort of other types of mental health service use, of which the majority of people had been sort of getting prescribed antidepressants or speaking to their GP. As Lindsay mentioned earlier, it was a small number of people who were currently using psychiatric or psychology or counselling services. What we found was that the majority, 72%, said that sort of they were able to be open at least some of the time while they were accessing mental health services, but 28% said they were rarely or never open about their trans status. So there are a sizable number of trans people using mental health services and not being able to really talk about their identity or their experiences in full. Well, on the next slide you'll sort of see some of the reasons why they might not feel confident about doing that. But where people had disclosed their trans status, or it had been perhaps disclosed for them on a letter that they didn't want sent to the mental health services from their GP, 29% felt that their gender identity was treated as a symptom of a mental health issue rather than as their genuine identity. And this is really, really important. So that's really unacceptable that in this day and age, but simply by virtue of having some other kind of mental health issue as well, people are then using that to disavow your stated identity, to say, oh, you're just saying that because you're mentally ill. I'm sure when you recover, like, and if you'll stop believing that. And 17% were told that their mental health issues were because they were trans, while they disagreed. So this isn't sort of like that. We acknowledge that some people, their depression or anxiety will be because they're trans, particularly if they've experienced horrible levels of discrimination or harassment, or feel that like every time that they try and simply go to the shops, they're told that they're worthless, they have catcalls and are threatened or have things thrown at them. Then that kind of minority stress and levels of discrimination can lead to somebody's mental health declining, in which case they probably would agree that it's to do with being trans. But 17%, we're saying no, it's because my partner has died, or it's because I've been made redundant just because my work has had to lay off tons of staff, not because I was trans, but just because of these other kind of life events and other stressors. And people are like going, no, you're depressed because you're trans people are depressed, go to the gender identity clinic, they'll help you. They deal with all mental health issues for trans people. So when we ask people about their experiences of service at the gender identity clinics and at mental health services, what we found was that in terms of the most common sort of like kind of issue was people having to educate their service providers about trans people. 40% of people said that they'd had to educate mental health service providers about trans people before they could kind of get access to services. Worryingly, 10% had to educate gender identity clinics about trans people as well, which one would hope that if there was one place you didn't have to educate, it might be a GIC. We had 20% of people saying that mental health services had told them that they were not really trans, which again is sort of like kind of a question whether even a GIC should be telling someone they're not really trans. If they feel they're trans, then they might not be a traditional version of trans, but it's surely for them to decide their own identities. But for mental health service providers who aren't expert in the area to be sort of saying, no, sorry, you don't fit the one case study I've ever heard of, so you can't be trans. And 29% of mental health service providers, 29% of the respondents said that mental health service providers had said they didn't know enough to provide trans healthcare to them. And so sometimes in these cases there have been people being told, oh, your local community mental health team can't see you for your social phobia because you're trans and we don't have any gender identity experts on our team. So yes, there's a really wide range of issues, including unprofessional curiosity about your body appearance. Mental health service providers, one wouldn't normally expect them to be wanting to see people's chests and genitals, but 7% of trans people said, well, actually, this was an issue. They were going, want to see what my surgery results look like. They're sort of like, oh, never come across this before, sort of like kind of, how did it turn out? Let's see. When you're there to talk about your emotions and your feelings, not do a show and tell striptease. And then, importantly, we also found that there was an NHS kind of triggering feelings of self-harm for trans people. 20% of respondents said they had wanted to harm themselves in relation to or because of involvement with the GIC or health service. And when we asked people what happened, they fell into sort of various categories. As mentioned before, there was frustration with long waiting times and treatment delays and people feeling hopeless and unable to cope as a result. There was appointment cancellations at the last minute where people were sort of going, okay, I just have to wait till such and such date, then I'll get my final assessment for hormones. Oh, I've just been told that's been rescheduled for 6 months later. There was inaccurate assessments, particularly sort of where people had gone for an assessment, perhaps for approval for surgery, and then had been sent a sort of letter back to their GP which had lots of inaccuracies or things that they hadn't actually said or not been understood how they'd sent them, and it then had to be disputed and eventually been overturned, but sort of 6 months lost while they tried to say, well, hang on, this person hasn't really listened to what I had to say, they haven't really understood my explanation of myself. And this was particularly likely to happen for people who didn't fit a really classic transsexual narrative. And as a result, a number of people said that they particularly would just try and reframe their experiences into a classic transsexual narrative in order to avoid the potential misunderstandings and delays that could result from giving a more nuanced and authentic version of themselves. being denied access to even seeing a gender specialist, or being denied access to hormone therapy or surgery. People also spoke about, this was not just within gender identity clinics or mental health services, but within wider general health care. People spoke about the trauma of having to undergo physical examinations, and how, sort of similar to somebody who's maybe got a history of having experienced sexual abuse or trauma in that regard, how it could really trigger up sort of like kind of very dysphoric feelings, very very sort of like kind of high levels of distress about themselves, to be reminded about parts of their body that they've been trying to ignore by having a physical examination. And then there was being given wrong information and advice, and frustration with negative or inappropriate attitudes such as the ones we've previously described to psychiatrists. And then also kind of some people talked about becoming acutely suicidal after being sort of discharged from GIC, particularly because they'd missed a single appointment. One person sort of actually spoke about how they had been raped and were experiencing post-traumatic stress disorder and were finding it very difficult to make it out of the house to attend appointments, and had not been met with any understanding about that, and instead being told, if you can't make it to the appointment and bring sort of like up-to-date blood work, then we're just stopping your hormones and we're throwing you out of the service. We asked people about the control over their own lives. We found that 72% of respondents said that being trans had an impact on the amount of control they had over their lives. 28% said that was entirely a negative impact, and very much sort of like linked that to the sense of dependency and being at the mercy of other people's decisions about their medical treatment. 9% felt it was an entirely positive impact, and sort of really kind of emphasised that by forming a trans expression of gender, they had freed themselves from other people's more narrow binary expectations of gender, and were now making up their own rules as they went along. And 25% felt there was both negative and positive impacts. So people said things like, I can do little things, such as dress a certain way, but as a whole things are just not set up to accommodate non-binary genders. Another, I'm more in control of my life, but attitudes can sometimes mean you don't have opportunities open to others. Another, it is my choice to transition, but the pace and how that happens is set by the NHS. We asked people if they'd lost or missed out on anything due to being trans, transitioning or expressing their gender identity. We found that sort of like kind of, while 30% didn't feel they'd lost or missed out on anything, 39% said, yes, I've lost something, and 50% said, yeah, I've missed out on something. And those included sort of like kind of typical things that you'd expect given the level of marginalisation that a lot of trans people have had to experience. So it's things like missing out on job opportunities, feeling that their career had stalled and they'd had to give up a career that they loved, not being able to earn as much money, or having to spend a lot of their money on their medical transitions if they couldn't go through the NHS for various reasons. People talked about not being able to have the same reproductive options as others, and having to give up on that sort of biologically related family. People had lost their homes. People talked about missing out on childhood and youth experiences that others might take for granted. And also about sort of not being able to access sport and leisure opportunities freely. And then people talked about kind of more conceptual aspects of equality and respect, happiness, friendships, intimacies, and then there was sort of issues around not having the same opportunities in relationships and dating, having missed out on opportunities for social life and personal development, and also people having dropped out of education early and missed out on qualifications. We asked people about transition regrets, because this is something that kind of gets banged on a bit about in the media. And we asked people about social changes they had made. And we also asked them separately about physical changes they had made. Because what we noticed was that in the media it tended to focus on regrets about physical changes, sort of like always like should you or shouldn't you have had surgery. But actually what we found was that it was social changes that seemed to be far more risky for people. 53% had no regrets about social changes they'd made, and 86% had no regrets about physical changes they'd made. 34% had minimal regrets about social changes, while only 10% had minor regrets about physical changes. And then 9% had significant regrets about social changes, while 2% had significant regrets about physical changes. So it was a very small number of people who had serious regrets about physical changes, but a slightly higher number who had regrets about social changes. Now, the regrets included things that one would expect sort of like kind of people to regret if they've happened to them, such as losing friends or family, the impact of transition on other people that they cared about, surgery complications, especially loss of sensitivity and choice of surgeon if they wished that they'd gone somewhere else where they could have had a better result. But then there was also aspects of regret that are things that kind of aren't to do with the change so much as a wish that they could have changed earlier or hadn't needed to ever change at all. So things that you can't necessarily easily eliminate don't mean that the transition was in any way a mistake or a problem, but just that they wish they had been able to do it sooner or had been born with no distress or variance about their gender. So I've just got a few quotes here. So people saying, I have no regrets for transition. It is the best thing I can do under the circumstances. I have regrets that I'm trans and wasn't just born male, but that isn't something I'm able to change. Another person saying, I do not regret transitioning, but I do wish that society was more understanding of trans people. I wish that the physical outcomes were better and that I had not lost so much: relationship, job, physical and mental health, home. And one person saying, I regret the loss of privilege I had as someone perceived as cisgendered. And I think that's actually quite an important one that doesn't get addressed enough, which is sort of like kind of, particularly if you've been living your life for quite a while without people knowing about your trans status, it can be quite an upheaval to suddenly sort of like kind of be marginalised and have people no longer respect you and your authenticity and your worth as an individual simply because they now know that you are trans. And it's something that often isn't really something that people are supported with or prepared for. But people also felt they had made gains as a result of being trans, and that's really important to emphasise as well. 81% felt they had gained something as a result of being trans, transitioning or expressing their gender identity. And this included confidence, new friends, improved relationships, a strong sense of kind of that they now were part of community and had a sense of belonging at last instead of feeling alienated from others by this kind of barrier of not really being seen in their authentic self. That they had learned they had resilience, that they'd been able to find a self-expression and acceptance, that they had gained knowledge and insight about gender and about the complexity of gender in particular. And people said that they gained happiness and contentment and, most importantly, a sense of a future. And we also found, sort of like kind of in terms of statistical evidence, that transition was related to improved life satisfaction. When we split up sort of the satisfaction with life scale scores, there was statistical significance by when separated by stage of desire to transition. And transition was related to reduced depression. Again, when we split the depression scale scores by stage of or desire to transition, we found statistically significant differences. So basically I want to finish with some questions. I'm not pretending that I have the answers to these questions, but I'm hoping maybe some of you have. I think it's about like, how can we try and make sure the complexity of gender is better appreciated and supported. Obviously that's really important within gender identity clinics, but also within wider society and within trans people themselves. There's this kind of issue of, sort of where people were very, very much perceiving that GICs were encouraging expressions of simplistic gender rigidity rather than a detailed and flexible gender exploration. Now, why is that perception there? Is it a hangover from previous years back experiences, or is it still that the GICs do feel more comfortable and safer if somebody seems to be more rigidly, yes, I've always known I'm female, I've always wanted to this, I always will, rather than somebody exploring their gender in a more flexible or fluid way? How can non-binary gender identities be better included and respected? And why is expressing a non-binary gender identity to increase the risk of regretting hormones or surgery? This was something that people talked about having experienced when they were seeking assistance. And yet there isn't any evidence that we've been able to come across that suggests that that necessarily is the case. Indeed, one could argue that given that sort of like kind of medical technology can't actually completely change your body, so that if you were somebody who wished to have always been born male, as a trans man, you're unlikely to ever get the exact body that you would have been born male with. Your body may end up more of a mixture of female and male characteristics by the end of your process of transition. So actually, if you feel like your gender identity is a mixture of male and female characteristics, then would that not be actually a closer match? The gender identity could actually give you the body that you feel suits your gender identity, rather than just the closest approximation that they can get to. And how can exploration of gender identity and emotional distress be supported without fear of harming future access to hormones and surgery? And how can mental health services become more understanding and inclusive of trans people? And finally, how can trans people be better supported to explore and process the personal losses, gains and regrets related to being trans, transitioning and expressing gender identity? There's a real fear often been around talking about losses and gains, because it's sort of somehow this kind of black and white, if you admit to regretting anything, then maybe your transition or your gender identity was some kind of mistake, rather than that's a natural process of change in life. And any sort of thing that you do in life, any choice or decision or implementation of authenticity that you make in life brings with it pros and cons that need to be processed. Thank you very much for listening.